And welcome back to another Infinidim training presentation for the 777. Today we're going to have a look at non-precision approaches using the VNAV approach mode. Obviously we're not going to cover this comprehensively, it's a pretty big subject, but we'll look at the fundamental essentials and go into a little bit of detail as we go. VNAV is the highest level of automation available for non-precision approaches, providing the best level of protection and the lowest flight deck workload. As such, it's the mode of choice for NPAs. VNAV is, of course, a required mode for certain RNAV and RNP GPS GNSS-based approaches. To use VNAV, the FMC has to be validated for lateral and vertical compliance between the CDU legs page and the approach documentation. For a VNAV approach to execute correctly, FMC has to be in approach mode. This is indicated by the presence of the vertical deviation indicator on the ND. Approaching the descent point for the approach, a set of standard actions ensure the correct commencement to final descent for the VNAV NPA. VNAV ALT on final approach is one of the hazards of Boeing's requirement to set various intermediate altitudes down final approach, and a hazard of a distracted PF. Learning to deal effectively with the VNAV ALT occurrence on final can save an approach from the need to go round after an otherwise recoverable above path excursion. We're also going to have a quick look at QNH errors, the effective temperature, and also some raw data monitoring. Validation of your FMC for LNAV and VNAV engagement looks relatively complex here, but for the most part, it's just detailing what you're already doing when reviewing the FMC legs page for a SID or a star or an approach in terms of lateral and vertical accuracy. So once you've done that, the most common problems tend to be found in just relatively benign inconsistencies, such as a discrepancy between when the actual descent point is in the legs page and the approach. And as long as you understand what's going to happen, you can decide whether you're going to accept that or whether you're going to intervene. So nominally, or technically, all approaches are supposed to be validated by the company before line crew are cleared to use them. Pilots still required to validate the legs page for use with LNAV and VNAV rather than relying on the inherent accuracy of an approved database. Also, an understanding of the potential flaws in database approaches and the discrepancies is likely to become more important when you're diverting to a non-precision approach at a non-route airfield where no one may have flown that approach before and an undetected flaw is more likely. So your basic legs page validation typically breaks into two main areas. You've got your lateral checks, which is your track and distance between waypoints, and that's required for you to successfully engage LNAV for the approach. Note that while shown here, the track discrepancy is nominally 1 degree between the CDU and Jefferson. Actually, the tolerance is anything up to 3 degrees. That typically comes from rounding errors and also a difference in the magnetic variation tables behind the ones used to create the approach and the ones that are used in the FMC to turn true track into magnetic track. But your limitations will be documented in your SOPs by your technical department. The vertical checks, which is your speed and altitudes, are required to engage VNAV and typically come with a prohibition about modifying any speeds or altitudes at or after the FAF, other than perhaps cold temperature corrections. One thing that's worth saying here is that it's really important to be able to develop the skill to validate your legs page by looking at your CDU and then looking at your chart. We tend to find that if you're a guy who looks at your chart and then looks at your CDU page to verify the approach, you tend to find it easy to drag inherent biases and expectations across to the CDU and see what you want to see. Whereas in order to validate from the CDU leg page to the FMC, you've got to understand what the CDU is telling you first and then compare that mental picture with what's depicted on the chart. And that tends to be the best way to pick up discrepancies in the approach. The other validation that's mentioned here, but it may not be as clear, is that basically your approach, your lateral and your vertical approach needs to take you to a point from which you can successfully complete the approach from the minima. So if the approach is taking you to 400 feet, 300 feet above the ground at about a mile short of the runway, that sounds pretty good. On the other hand, if it's taking you to the minima straight over the runway threshold, now you've got a problem and VNAV is probably not going to be available to you. That's the sort of thing you need to pick up when you're validating the approach. Okay, let's move on and have a look at on approach logic. Okay, so let's have a look at FMC on approach logic, since this does tend to cause confusion at times. Remember that fundamentally VNAV is designed to be driven by the vertical path and speeds in your FMC. Sure, you get to interfere with this through the MCP speed and altitude intervention features, but the fundamental paradigm is VNAV doing what the FMC tells it to do. Meanwhile, it's pretty clear that the FMC actually has three vertical modes. It's got a climb mode, a cruise mode, and a descent mode. If it isn't clear to you which one is active at any point in time, if you reach down to your CDU and press the VNAV switch, one of the pages will come up. That's the one the VNAV thinks you're in. So if you're on descent being vectored for the approach, you reach down and press the CDU button, and up comes the climb page. As far as the FMC is concerned, you're still trying to get to your cruise altitude. This distinction is important because one of the on-approach logic engagement conditions you can see here is A, the FMC being in descent mode, along with flap extension. There are other triggers you can see, but most typically we'll see on-approach engage when the aircraft is on descent and the flaps are extended to begin configuring for the approach. That's typically when you'll see VNAV path engage if it already hasn't. Worth noting here is that if you're actually below your enunciated VNAV path at this point, the aircraft will actually level off in VNAV path and wait until it's on path before continuing descent. Remember I mentioned there were moments of confusion? This could be one of them. So let's have a look at the engagement of on approach mode, what that actually means for us. Well, it means several things. The first thing being that we get to remain in VNAV path despite having speed intervention active. This allows us to control our speed while the elevators maintain the required FMC vertical path down final, allowing us to configure for flap configurations and speeds while remaining hopefully locked on our path. On approach mode also allows us to descend away in VNAV away from the MCP altitude setting that may be above the aircraft, such as we want to do when we've got the missed approach altitude set. And the last point at the bottom describes that mode where the FMC levels off in VNAV path. So what happens when VNAV on approach logic fails to engage and why? Typically on approach for us fails to engage because even though you've extended the flaps, the FMC is not actually in descent mode. You'll see this typically when returning to your destination after you've had a problem on departure. The FMC is waiting for you to reach cruise altitude before it'll then calculate a top of descent and transition into descent mode, but you've got something else in mind. The most obvious indication in this is a lack of vertical path indicator on the ND, and you should be looking for that as you're getting ready for your approach. But also, if you were to reach down again to your CDU and press the VNAV switch, you'll either get the climb or the cruise page. There are a couple of ways to correct this, but the recommended solution is to use the descend now prompt on the VNAV descent page. You'll need to execute that change in order to force the FMC into descent mode. Shortly after that, you should see the vertical path deviator in the indicator on the ND, and you'll know hopefully all is well. I will mention that there is another technique where you enter the current altitude into the FM cruise page and execute. In the 777, this has two problems. Firstly, it almost always deletes all the altitudes in your legs page at or above the cruise altitude you just entered, potentially violating the approach altitudes that you've probably just verified. Secondly, it recalculates you a descent point for the approach just prior to the initial approach or FAF, depending on where you are, which is pretty late in the day for you to find out that FMC and VNAV are now ready for the approach. Okay, let's have a look at engaging VNAV for the approach. Okay, so let's now talk about engaging VNAV for the approach. So during your type rating, your initial training, you'll have been taught a standard 1, 2, 3 type of technique for VNAV engagement prior to a non-precision approach. This method should be tried and true and work pretty well most of the time, as long as ATC stay out of your way. So let's begin with the aircraft established on a level flight path into the final descent point, flap 5 speed, and LNAV engaged. So as the aircraft approaches 2 nautical miles to the descent point, we're going to configure for final approach, then get VNAV engaged. So gear down, speed brake armed, flap 20, set the speed, bring up the checklist, and then the MCP altitude selector to the next altitude, could be the FAF, could be the MDA or some other altitude restriction, will engage VNAV, look for VNAV path, and open and possibly have to reset the speed window. This is not a bad time to recall whether you've been cleared for the instrument approach. Let's watch it happen. So having sorted all that out, we'll continue level towards the final descent point. And as we commence descent, flap 30, set the speed, landing checklist, and we're on our way down the approach. Now that we have our basic model for VNAV engagement, when we're in that world where all approaches are flown level into the platform altitude, let's extend it a little to what happens in the real world, where we're forced to engage VNAV for approach when above, well above, or below the VNAV path. Anytime you're engaging VNAV for approach and everything else is set up, you should be able to look at the indications on your ND, the vertical path deviation indicator, and predict what VNAV will do when it engages and why. So first off, let's just remind ourselves and have a look at what an on-path engagement looks like. So our FMA heads straight into VNAV path with the autothrottle in speed, and the aircraft descends or flies level to follow the FMC path. While on descent, if the aeroplane trends high on the path, thrust will reduce, and if necessary, indicated airspeed will increase above the MCP selected speed in order to maintain the VNAV path. For a below path scenario, the speed will be maintained and thrust will be increased as required to keep the VNAV flight path. This is your basic VNAV path approach that we hope to see most of the time during our non-precision approaches. It's crucial to note that as you engage VNAV path, the MC speed window will close and revert to FMC commanded speed. As soon as it's closed, you'll need to open it again through speed intervention to manage your speed down final in accordance with FCTM guidelines. The trick here is to actually wait for the speed window to close. Selecting VNAV and immediately pressing the MCP speed selector doesn't do the job. You have to wait a second or three for the VNAV path to actually engage on the FMA and the MC speed window subsequently close before you can open it again. Ask me how I know this. So let's now have a look at what happens with a slightly above path VNAV engagement. For the situation where you are less than 150 feet above the path, the process is essentially similar to an on-path engagement. The FMA engages in speed VNAV path, and for a descent, thrust will reduce and speed will increase if necessary in order to regain the path expeditiously. Moving on now to a well above path engagement, greater than 150 feet. Now VNAV engages the autothrottle in idle and the pitch mode in VNAV speed because the aircraft is out of the nominal capture region of the FMC path. With idle thrust, the aircraft now descends at the selected speed until capturing the VNAV path, whereby speed and VNAV path will then engage. Note that prior to the path capture, the FMA pitch mode is VNAV speed, so the AFDS commands the FMC or MCP selected speed and will not accelerate in order to more quickly capture the path. It's a brute force, idle descent, hope it works kind of solution. Touch a speed brake at this point may not go astray. And finally, a below path engagement. It's a pretty simple speed VNAV path engagement where the aircraft levels off if descending in order to fly into the FMC path and then continues descent down in VNAV path. So moving on now, let's have a look at this pesky requirement to set intermediate altitude restrictions in the MCP altitude selector during final approach. Setting altitude constraints in the MCP altitude selector during final on a VNAV path non-precision approach is a contentious issue that divides many airlines. I'm going to look at this from a Boeing FCTM letter of the law, spirit of intent kind of approach, but just like me, you do what your airline tells you to do, no matter how much you may disagree. Firstly, it has to be set up front that the entire FMC legs page altitude speed constraints VNAV path autopilot flight director system is designed for you to set MDA early and watch the aircraft fly itself down into initial, intermediate and final approach, protected initially by validated legs page track speed altitude restrictions and eventually by a coded glide path angle, all monitored by a pilot who's under low workload with lots of spare capacity for monitoring and keeping up with the aircraft without the need to constantly adjust the MCP altitude selector on the way down. As great as this design is when it's well managed, it's also an excellent one for killing situationally unaware pilots and their unsuspecting passengers. Because time and time again over the years, crew that started out on a relatively benign VNAV path approach have thrown the aircraft into vertical speed or even flight level change, with an inappropriately low selection in the MCP altitude selector, exposing the aircraft to the risk of an unprotected descent towards terrain. As such, the FCTM comes with the requirement to set intermediate approach altitudes in the MCP altitude selector when flying a VNAV path approach. Starting further back for a minute, Boeing would prefer that all restrictions are set during descent. However, between top of descent and the initial approach fix, so-called closely spaced restrictions that unnecessarily, shall we say, increase workload in the flight deck can be aggregated to the lowest restriction with a few caveats. The FCTM refers. Still, the initial approach fix altitude must be set. Between the IAF and the final approach fix altitude, again, closely spaced restrictions can be skipped over, but you've got to meet them. But the FAF altitude restriction has to still be set. After the FAF, as long as an approach angle is published on the legs page, glide path angle, you can go straight to setting the minima prior to then setting the missed approach altitude. All of that said, there is scope in the FCTM to stop setting these intermediate altitudes after the IAF once you're established in VNAV path and inbound to a fix on your legs page, after which there is a coded validated glide path angle. So after the IAF, you could technically stop setting altitude MCP restrictions as long as there is a glide path angle on your legs page after the last MCP altitude setting waypoint. Remember that the reason these altitudes are being set in the MCP altitude selector is not so that you can check compliance with the altitude range ring green arc on your ND and then keep moving multiple waypoints on ahead. They're being set so that the aircraft physically cannot descend below the IAF, FAF or altitude restriction until the crew have verified that compliance is assured. Thus, pre-selecting altitudes more than one fix ahead is strongly discouraged. That said, visual verification of the next protected waypoint altitude crossing coupled with VNAV path enunciation on your FMA is enough to ensure compliance and move the MCP altitude selector on to the next waypoint after that, and then sit and wait until that waypoint becomes active. Okay, so let's just summarize. You need to set the IAF, you need to set the FAF, you need to set the minima, and then the missed approach altitude, unless you have a coded glide path angle in the legs page active. Note that even if you are saved from the onerous burden of having to set the FAF altitude, you must set the minima before then moving on to setting the missed approach altitude. From the diagram here, you can see that at some waypoints we have the on-path crossing altitudes, the minimum safe constraint altitudes, and that some of the crossing altitudes physically can't be set in the MCP altitude selector, such as 2250. So if you're going to set that, you'd need to round it up or round it down. So which altitudes are you going to set? Principally, the FCTM recommends setting the crossing altitudes, although there is justification in the FCTM to set the lower constraint altitudes as an alternative procedure. One advantage of setting crossing altitudes is that if your vertical speed is stable, and will remain so, then the altitude range arc should give you a good prediction of when you'll hit the MCP altitude setting in relation to the waypoints on your ND. The big advantage that I see of setting constraint altitudes is a reduced likelihood of an inadvertent VNAV ALT capture. In this case, when you're assessing your flight path with the altitude range arc, as long as the arc, the constraint, is at or after your next waypoint, you're safe, even if you are slightly below path. I personally prefer the constraint method since it keeps me clear of VNAV ALT captures, as well as philosophically being in keeping with the reason we're setting MCP altitude settings in the first place, to remain clear of terrain. Finally, for those cases where the published altitudes aren't in hundreds of feet, for crossing altitudes, round them down as long as they aren't below the published constraint altitudes. So here we are with VNAV path engaged, speed intervention active, and the aircraft configured for landing. So it's all over bar the shouting, or at least all over bar the arguing about the setting of intermediate altitudes. So we'll set the IAF altitude, set the FAF altitude, and then the minima, at least until protected by a legs page glide path angle. We can set the missed approach altitude when 300 feet below the MAA and no more altitudes left to set in the MCP altitude selector, basically after we've set the minima. At the minima, if the flight directors aren't going to take you to the runway threshold and the threshold crossing altitude, cycle both flight directors off at the same time, then the pilot monitoring flight director comes back on. Typically, the time to identify and discuss the need to cycle the flight directors at the minima is during the setup and arrival briefing.
Minimums.
And contrary to all expectations you may have from the previous slides, the aircraft lands. An inadvertent VNAV ALT capture on final approach demands good situational awareness and timely recognition and response on the part of the crew. A VNAV ALT encounter poorly dealt with can expose the aircraft to the threat of compromised terrain clearance or an unstable approach if not handled well. Remember that VNAV ALT means that VNAV wants the aircraft to go somewhere vertically and the altitude selector on the MCP got in the way. The proper response is to change the altitude selector to an appropriate lower setting, press it to engage a VNAV descent, and then monitor the subsequent autopilot flight director response. In recovering from a VNAV ALT capture, the recovery procedure will commence with either VNAV speed or VNAV path, depending on how far above the path you find yourself when you recognize the problem. If you're on top of your FMA, you'll pick up on the VNAV ALT enunciation prior to 150 foot above path divergence. With the correct recovery technique, VNAV path will re-engage, and assuming sufficient altitude, a good recovery is likely. So here we are on path, configured, but the crew have forgotten to set the altitude selector to the next restriction. So as the aircraft proceeds past the point where the path wants to descend through the MCP altitude selector, VNAV ALT engages. The aircraft flies level, and we're left with an above path divergence of less than 150 feet. With the MCP altitude selector reset and the button pushed, VNAV path engages and the aircraft descends towards the path. If necessary, VNAV will accelerate the aircraft above the MCP selected speed in order to expedite the path capture. At some point, you'll need to set the MCP altitude selector to the next restriction, the minima, or the missed approach altitude. The approach continues, stable by 1,000 feet. Note that you're pressing the altitude selector once only to take the autopilot flight director out of VNAV ALT. Multiple presses can potentially delete legs page altitude constraints between the aircraft and the MCP altitude selector. Although altitude restrictions at and after the FAF are protected, those prior to that may not be. Be careful. If the VNAV ALT recovery is actioned after the aircraft exceeds path by more than 150 feet, this time VNAV speed engages. The autothrottle reduces towards idle and a basic descent towards the VNAV path is established at the MCP selected speed. Okay, so once again, on path configured, but we've forgotten to set the altitude selector to the next restriction. So VNAV ALT engages, the aircraft flies level, and we end up with an above path divergence by greater than 150 feet. The recovery procedure is as before. We'll reset the MCP altitude selector and push it just the once. This time VNAV speed engages and the aircraft descends towards path at the MCP selected speed and eventually idle thrust. Note the aircraft remains at the MCP selected speed and does not accelerate to capture path more quickly. Depending on altitude and configuration, some speed brake might be beneficial to expedite the VNAV path capture. The speed window remains open throughout, and eventually at 150 feet above the path, speed VNAV path engages. With the autopilot flight director back in VNAV path, the approach continues to be stable by 1,000 feet and headed down to the runway. Remember that at any point, if it becomes clear the aircraft will not be stable by 1,000 feet above the runway, a missed approach should be commenced. An underlying threat to all non-precision approaches is errors in the barometric setting by the crew, QNH. Let's have a look at an error in QNH setting for your basic VNAV non-precision approach, although this problem impacts basic modes as well. In this scenario, a falsely high QNH has been provided by ATC. In this instance, the crew have not followed SOPs and have failed to independently verify the QNH, and so the stage is set. So, where is the aircraft? A falsely high QNH will have the aircraft low on approach by approximately 30 feet per millibar. So what indications are we going to have the flight deck that allow us to pick up on this? Essentially, there'll be no indication of this problem on the flight deck, assuming the radio altimeter is not yet registering. Even as the aircraft flies a path 300 feet below the promulgated approach, there'll be no altimeter indications of a deviation, as the aircraft passes through fixes with minimum crossing altitudes 300 feet low, but indicating the correct indicated altitude. A situationally aware crew, particularly one with previous experience of the approach, may well pick up on a disconnect between the altitude and the radio altitude once it becomes alive. So the question that remains is, what will be the first clear sign that we have a problem?
Too low terrain.
Typically, the first indication of a problem will be either the visual reference with runway, VASI, PAPI, and a clear below slope indication, or an eGPWS terrain alert. Note that potentially the eGPWS may not alert if the aircraft is within the airfield environment. Airmanship and situational awareness is the key. Both pilots should hear and verify altimetry settings. Significant differences between that provided by ATC and previously received ATIS MEDAR QNH values should be queried. A review of terrain on the approach chart should give some indication of the type of differences that can be expected between altimeter and radio altimeter. Most non-precision approaches these days are either RNP or RNAV, or even if they're based on ground-based nav aids, benefit from some kind of GPS primary instrument that allows us to take ground-based nav aids pretty much for granted. But let's remind ourselves of what life used to be like. NAVRAD selections for non-precision approaches are based on procedure and systems knowledge and previous approach experience, along with a few basic rules. Crew need to ensure that in the event of a non-GPS, non-GNSS based approach, raw data is available to check tracking prior to final descent from the platform minimum safe altitude or lower safe altitude. If your approach is based on an NDB, they need to be manually tuned, and typically tuning both ADFs to the station allows maximum flexibility to look at the different VORs simultaneously with the NDB approach aid should this requirement exist. For a VOR approach, unless prior knowledge is available, typically you'll leave the VORs to procedure tune. If you're vectored close to the FAF, it may be that the VORs will procedure tune a little late. Note that if you're using procedure tuning or manually tuning, the VOR will be available throughout the approach, and auto-tune VOR may not. For RNAV GPS GNSS approaches, there's no raw data requirement apart from your basic ANP, RNP. The FMC should monitor and alert to an occurrence of nav-enabled RNP. That said, it's incumbent on the crew to ensure the correct RNP selection prior to final descent from the platform altitude, minimum safe altitude, lower safe altitude. One thing worth pointing out if you haven't seen it for a while is the difference in the ident enunciations for the VOR and DME. The standard one being the one in the middle here with Echo Lima November in large font. That indicates that the VOR has been identified. This one up here indicates that the VOR is tuned, but neither the VOR nor the DME can be identified by the FMC. And then down the bottom here we have the small font indication, which tells us that the VOR could not be identified, but the DME could. Boeing 777 altimetry is adversely affected by any deviation from standard temperature, with no form of automatic compensation currently available. The degree of altitude deviation is proportional to both the degree of temperature variation away from standard as reported at the airfield and the aircraft's elevation above the airport surface. The effect of this is that in non-standard temperatures the aircraft is further from the path as the temperature deviation increases and as the aircraft's height above the runway increases. Deviations above ISA, warmer temperatures, result in a steeper approach requiring higher rates of descent down final, which could be well worth mention during the arrival briefing. Lower temperatures are the reverse, where the aircraft commences barometric-based approaches such as VNAV MPAs below the required altitudes, flying a shallower approach slope than promulgated. Significantly low temperatures can be a safety threat that may require corrections in the FMC legs page to ensure terrain clearance. Note there will be no altitude indication of this problem during the approach. Crew must determine the likely effects from the ambient temperature of the airfield and correct accordingly. Corrections for cold temperatures come from the FCOM and FCTM and are rarely significant unless the ambient airfield temperature is below zero. Note that corrections may be required for both the minimum approach altitudes as well as the missed approach. Corrections to your legs page altitude constraints to restore the VNAV path to the appropriate profile are referenced to airport ambient temperature and height above airport elevation. For a more detailed description of cold temperature altimetry problem as it impacts all variations of departure, arrival and approach, see the dedicated cold temperature presentation. Okay, so let's just summarize with a few of the highlights. Validate and brief the approach. The information you need to mitigate any surprises in the approach are on the chart and in the legs page and in the discrepancies between the two. LNAV and VNAV into the star is the best way to do it, but with ATC involved, otherwise, work out ahead of time where you want to plan to engage VNAV and the response of the aircraft. MCP speed window, is it going to descend? That kind of thing. Intermediate altitude setting is all about where the approach is coded from on the legs page. Prior to this point, you need to protect yourself from inadvertent descent into terrain. Cross-checking QNH is absolutely crucial and hopefully in line with your SOPs. Recovering from an inadvertent VNAV ALT capture is simple if you get onto it straight away, or in fact if you don't get caught by it in the first place. Finally, know what you'll be required to see and do at the minima in respect of the autopilot and the flight director cycling. Thank you.